Guys, lean in. Let's talk about the word unsinkable. It's not just a label stitched on a blueprint or shouted in a press release. It's a promise. A chest-thumping, pride-swelling boast that says, "We've outsmarted nature. We've tamed the elements. We've built something that will last forever." We heard it loud and clear in 1912, when the RMS Titanic slipped out of Southampton, its owners crowing it could laugh at icebergs and carry enough lifeboats for only half its passengers, because why waste space on something that would never sink? We all know how that ended. 1,500 souls lost, a promise shattered by a slab of frozen water. And 33 years later, in the smoky, candlelit bunker rooms of Imperial Japan, where maps were covered in red ink marking lost territories and generals stared at ration lists with hollow eyes, they whispered that word again. But this time it wasn't just a ship. It was a scream, a last, furious roar of steel and national pride, meant to stop a war that was already burning down their empire city by city. They called it Yamato, named after the mythic heartland of Japan, the birthplace of their gods. And for a while, as it cut through the Pacific, even the sea seemed to hold its breath in fear. Let me paint this picture for you so vividly, you'll almost feel the salt spray on your face. Its standard displacement stood at 65,000 tons, but when fully loaded with ammunition, fuel, and supplies, its displacement soared to over 72,000 tons, even reaching 79,000 tons at maximum load, a behemoth unmatched by any battleship of its era. When it steamed out of Kure Harbor, its wake could swamp fishing boats and small destroyers like they were plastic toys in a bathtub. Local fishermen would stop mending their nets just to stare, muttering that it ate the horizon. Its main guns? 18.1 inches across, wider than a man's shoulders. These monsters weren't just big. They were devastatingly powerful, capable of piercing over 500 millimeters of homogeneous steel armor from 25 kilometers away, far exceeding the protective limits of America's main battleships at the time. A full-grown sailor could stand inside those barrels without bending his knees, and you could fit a crate of sake next to him. Each shell it fired weighed 3,220 pounds, about the same as a compact car, or two sumo wrestlers stacked together, and could hit a target 26 miles away. That's like standing in downtown Tokyo, pulling the trigger, and blowing up a battleship docked in Yokohama. Its armor? 16 inches thick at the waterline, sloped like the walls of a medieval castle, made of Vickers hardened steel that had been heated and hammered until it was harder than granite. Engineers bragged it could bounce off any enemy shell like a marble off a stone wall. To the young men of Japan, fresh off farms and fishing boats, it wasn't a warship. It was a floating mountain, a modern-day Mount Fuji made of metal and gunpowder, a symbol that screamed, "We will not fall. We will not break." To 23-year-old Taro Suzuki, though, it was just home. Taro grew up in a tiny fishing village on Hokkaido's windswept coast, where the only big thing was the endless gray ocean and the occasional storm that would tear roofs off houses. He'd never seen a building taller than the village temple, just one story with a leaky roof, before he got the draft notice folded into a government envelope. When he first stepped aboard the Yamato in 1943, moored at Truck Lagoon where the water was so blue it looked fake, he stopped dead in his tracks, his new uniform too tight across the shoulders. "I thought it was an island someone had nailed guns to," he told a historian decades later, his hands trembling a little as he spoke. "We walked up the gangway for 20 minutes, and I still couldn't see the top of the superstructure. The sailors ahead of me were just as wide-eyed. One kid from Kyoto tripped over his own feet and fell into the water. His post, a loader on a 25mm Type 96 anti-aircraft gun, one of 152 such guns dotted around the deck, though everyone joked they were just for show. The Type 96 was a piece of junk. It jammed if you loaded the shells too fast, fired slower than a farmer's shotgun, and couldn't reach high enough to hit most American planes. But Taro didn't care. The ship smelled like machine oil, sweat, and the cheap ramen the cooks served in chipped ceramic bowls. Smells that became familiar, even comforting. It vibrated so hard at night that he could feel it in his bones, like the hum of his dad's fishing boat engine. And after months at sea, bouncing between empty ports, that vibration felt like a lullaby. He, like 2,699 other sailors, slept soundly in his narrow bunk, believing the ship was untouchable, invincible, unsinkable. And yet, on April 7, 1945, in the East China Sea north of Okinawa, where the water is cold enough to sting your skin even in spring, that mountain died. Not in a glorious duel with an American battleship, the way its designers had drawn in their blueprints. Cannons roaring, shells crashing, two Titans going down swinging, flags still flying. No, it died under a cloudless sky so blue it mocked the chaos, swarmed by 386 tiny, buzzing American planes that looked like angry wasps next to its hull. It took just 2 hours. 2 hours to bring down the unsinkable giant. Of the roughly 3,300 people on board, including naval command staff beyond the ship's standard crew of 2,700 to 3,000, only 276 survived. Taro Suzuki was one of them. The Yamato, Japan's last hope, the greatest battleship ever built, sank on its first and only real combat mission. This isn't just the story of a ship. It's the story of how a country bet everything on a dinosaur, right as the world was learning to fly. It's the story of how pride can blind you to the future, and how even the strongest steel can't outrun change. To get why the Yamato existed, why Japan poured 500,000 man-hours and millions of tons of steel into it, you have to understand the mess Japan was in by the 1930s. Let's rewind to 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty. It was a global agreement to stop an arms race, but for Japan it felt like a slap in the face. The treaty said Japan could only have 60% as many warships as the US and Britain. For a country with imperial dreams, with its eyes on China, Korea, and the Pacific, that stung like salt in a wound. Newspapers called it national humiliation. Military leaders fumed in their offices. But by 1934, they'd had enough. They tore up the treaty, slammed the door on international negotiations, and declared to the world, "We'll play by our own rules." Here's the problem, though: they couldn't outbuild America. Not even close. The US was an industrial giant, churning out steel, ships, and planes like a factory that never slept. In 1937, the US made 30 million tons of steel. Japan made 5 million. So they came up with a desperate plan. If we can't make more ships, we'll make a ship so powerful, one of it is worth 5 of theirs. This was the core of the decisive battle doctrine, and the Yamato-class battleships were its ultimate expression. Critically, their design was fully targeted at America's Iowa-class battleships, with Japan's Navy hoping to offset the US's numerical superiority with overwhelming single-ship quality. This decision itself was a microcosm of strategic miscalculation. By the time the Yamato launched, the era of battleship duels had already been overtaken by carrier-based aviation. It wasn't just a military strategy. It was a prayer, a hope that one weapon could turn the tide against a foe with endless resources. Building the Yamato was like building a secret, one that 10,000 workers swore to take to their graves. The Kure Naval Arsenal, where it was constructed, was wrapped in barbed wire and giant sisal rope curtains so thick, no spy with a telescope could see inside. Workers had to sign oaths of silence in blood. If they talked to their wives or kids about the big project, they'd be arrested by military police, maybe executed. When parts were shipped in by train, giant steel plates, gun barrels that needed their own flat cars, they were labeled farm equipment or construction materials. Even the designers called it a special kind of warship on blueprints, never writing Yamato in case the plans were stolen. Why all the secrecy? Because if America found out, they'd build something bigger, something stronger to counter it. Japan couldn't afford that arms race, so they built it in the dark. Literally. Night shifts worked by dim lanterns instead of electric lights, to avoid being spotted by Allied spy planes flying overhead. Taro met a welder once, an old man with burns on his hands, who'd worked on the keel. He said the steel was so thick, up to 20 inches in places, that his torch would glow red-hot and barely make a mark. We'd work 12-hour shifts, our eyes burning from the smoke, the welder told him, slipping Taro a cigarette. The foreman would yell, "Build it like it's holding up the empire." We weren't building a ship. We were building a god. Let's geek out on the numbers for a second. because they're still mind-blowing even 80 years later. Length: 863 feet. That's longer than 3 football fields laid end to end, or 2 statues of liberty stacked on top of each other. Height: from the keel, the bottom of the hull, to the top of the mainmast, it was 183 feet, taller than a 16-story building. You could fit a small apartment complex inside its hull. The 3 main turrets, each with 3 18.1-inch guns, weighed 2,500 tons apiece. That's heavier than an entire World War I destroyer or 500 elephants. When those guns fired a full broadside, 9 shells at once, the recoil was so powerful it pushed the 70,000-ton ship sideways 3 feet in the water. Sailors who weren't braced against a bulkhead would get knocked flat on their backs. Some even broke bones. The armor, the main belt, the thick steel around the hull, was 16.1 inches thick, but the turret faces were 25 inches, thicker than a man's torso, and hard enough to stop a 16-inch shell from an American battleship. Inside that armor, they packed 12 boilers that burned heavy oil, for steam turbines that generated 150,000 horsepower, and enough fuel to sail 7,200 miles at 16 knots. That's like going from Tokyo to San Francisco and back, with enough left over to sail to Hawaii. But here's the kicker, the fatal flaw that engineers tried to ignore. All that armor, all those guns, made the ship slow. It topped out at 27 knots, about 31 miles per hour, while American carriers like the USS Enterprise could hit 33 knots. It was a giant, yes, but a slow giant. And in war, where speed means life or death, slow is a death sentence. But here's the tragic, almost poetic part. While Japan's engineers were obsessing over how thick to make the armor and how far the guns could fire, the world was changing right under their noses. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and accidentally proved the death of the battleship. What sank the American battleships moored there? Planes. Not other battleships. Planes. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers that flew low, dropped their payloads, and vanished before the battleships could even fire back. The very thing Japan used to start the war was the thing that would kill their greatest weapon. The Yamato was launched in December 1941, right after Pearl Harbor. To fanfare and parades, school children sang songs about it. Newspapers printed its picture on the front page. But for years, it did nothing. Literally nothing. It sat in ports like Truk and Kure, a floating trophy. Why? Because the Navy was too scared to risk it. If the Yamato sank, what was left of Japan's pride? What was left of the invincible myth they'd built? So it shuffled between bases, acting as a floating hotel for admirals who wanted to look important, or a training ship for new recruits who'd never seen a warship before. Taro spent 1943 and 1944 painting the same gun turret over and over. The Navy loved shiny brass. Polishing brass rails that no enemy would ever see, and listening to old sailors with missing fingers talk about the big battle that was always coming. We'd sit on the deck at night, watching the stars and passing around a canteen of sake, he remembered. Someone would point to the big guns and say, "When we fire those, the Americans will run home to their mothers." But deep down, we all knew we were just waiting for something to happen, good or bad. The Yamato finally got to see action at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the turning point of the Pacific War, where Japan lost 4 of its best aircraft carriers and the tide of the war turned forever. But sea is a stretch. It was 300 miles behind the Japanese carrier fleet, too far to fire its big guns, too slow to catch up. Taro and his crewmates stood at their stations all day, staring at the horizon. They could hear the distant rumble of explosions, like thunder on a clear day, and see the black smoke curling up into the sky, smoke from burning carriers, from their own side. But they couldn't do a thing. While Japan's best carriers burned and sank, their sailors drowning or burning alive, the Yamato floated there, powerless, a spectator. That's when Taro first felt the doubt creep in, the first crack in the unsinkable myth. He was cleaning his gun that night, wiping oil off the barrel, when he turned to his gun captain, a gruff man named Sato who'd fought in China. "If we're so strong, Captain, if this ship is unbeatable, why are we hiding back here?" he asked, his voice quieter than he meant. Captain Sato just stared at him, his face lit by a single lantern. He didn't yell, didn't hit him. He just said, "Be quiet, Suzuki. The Emperor's shield doesn't question orders." But his hands were shaking as he lit a cigarette. Taro knew then they were all just pretending. Let's talk more about Taro, because he's the reason this story isn't just a list of numbers and dates. He's the heart of it, the ordinary guy caught up in something huge, something he didn't understand. He was the youngest of 3 brothers. His oldest brother had died fighting in Manchuria. His middle brother was a soldier in the Philippines. His dad was a fisherman who'd lost a hand in a storm when Taro was 10. Waves had smashed the boat, and a rope had torn his hand clean off. Taro dropped out of school at 14 to help with the boats, mending nets at dawn and hauling in cod until his back ached. He knew the sea, how to read the way waves curled to tell a storm was coming, how to smell rain on the wind. That's why the Navy put him on anti-aircraft duty. They said, "You've got good eyes, you can spot planes far off." But he hated it. He missed his mom's miso soup, thick with tofu and green onions. He missed mending nets at dawn, the way the sea turned pink when the sun came up. He missed the smell of salt and fish, not oil and gunpowder. On the Yamato, he made friends with a boy from Osaka named Kenji, who'd been a tailor before the war. He could fix a torn uniform so well you couldn't even see the stitch. Kenji was small, with a scar on his cheek from a childhood fight, and he never stopped talking about his sister's wedding, which he'd missed because of the draft. One night, Kenji sewed Taro a small pocket inside his uniform jacket, lined with waterproof cloth, to hold a water-stained photo of his family's fishing boat, the Hikari Maru, light ship. "So you don't lose it when we're in action," Kenji said, grinning. Taro laughed, shaking his head. "When will we ever be in action? We're just sitting here." Life on board was a weird, exhausting mix of crushing boredom and constant, low-level terror. Days dragged by. 6 a.m. wake-up call, cold rice for breakfast, then cleaning guns until your hands were raw, attending drills where officers yelled about discipline and honor, and standing watch for hours, staring at an empty sea. Nights were worse, huddled in bunks stacked 3 high, listening to the engines thrum and wondering if this was the night an American submarine's torpedo would hit. The food was terrible. Stale rice that tasted like cardboard, canned fish that had been sitting in storage since 1941, it tasted like metal, and sometimes, if the supply ship came, a slice of pickled plum, luxury. The officers were strict, most of them old men who'd never seen combat but loved yelling. Once, Taro was 5 minutes late to a drill because he was helping Kenji fix a tear in his uniform. Kenji had tripped over a rope. The officer, a short man with a bushy mustache, hit him 3 times with a bamboo stick, hard enough to leave bruises that lasted a week. "Discipline is what makes us strong," the officer yelled, spittle flying. But Taro saw the way the officers' hands shook when they read radio reports. Guam fallen, Saipan lost, the Americans landing on Leyte. He saw them huddled in the mess hall, whispering, their faces pale. By 1944, the Yamato's invincibility felt like a lie they all told themselves to sleep at night. Taro and Kenji would sneak up to the deck after curfew, lie on their backs and talk about going home. "I'll open a tailor shop in Osaka," Kenji said. "You can fish like your dad. We'll meet up for sake once a week." Taro would nod, but he didn't believe it. Not anymore. Then, in October 1944, the Musashi sank. The Yamato's sister ship, same size, same guns, same unsinkable armor. American planes swarmed it in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes slamming into its hull. It took 4 hours to go down, but it went down, taking 1,023 sailors with it. Taro heard the news from a cook named Tanaka, who'd snuck a radio into the galley and kept it tuned to Allied stations. He said it was to know the enemy, but everyone knew he just wanted the truth. Tanaka pulled Taro and Kenji into a storage closet, turned the radio down to a whisper, and let them listen. When the announcement ended, no one spoke. That night, Taro and Kenji sat on the deck, their feet hanging over the edge, staring at the dark water. The sea was calm, no waves, just the glow of distant stars. "If the Musashi can sink," Kenji said, his voice trailing off, like he couldn't finish the sentence. Taro didn't answer. He just took out the photo of the Hikari Maru from his pocket, now so worn the edges were frayed, and wiped it with his sleeve. He thought of his dad, missing a hand, trying to run the fishing boat alone. He thought of his mom, sitting by the window every day, waiting for a letter that might never come. He thought of Kenji's sister, waiting for her brother to come home for her wedding. That's when he stopped believing in Unsinkable. That's when he knew, sooner or later, the Yamato would meet the same fate. That purpose, when it finally came, wasn't victory. It was suicide. By April 1945, Japan was broken. The American military had firebombed Tokyo, killing 100,000 people in one night. Okinawa was under attack. 100,000 American troops, 1,200 ships, closing in on the home islands. The Imperial Navy had no carriers left. Most had been sunk at Midway or Leyte Gulf. No planes worth flying. The few they had were being used for kamikaze attacks. No fuel, no hope. In a state of strategic delirium, some would call it madness, the Navy conceived Operation Tengo. The plan was so crazy, even some admirals called it insane to the Navy minister's face. The Yamato, the light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers would sail to Okinawa, with just enough fuel for a one-way trip. No air cover, no backup. They'd beach the Yamato on Okinawa's coast, use its colossal guns as immovable artillery batteries to blow up American landing ships, and then the surviving crew would grab rifles and fight as infantry until they were all killed. It wasn't a military operation. It was a ritual suicide, a deliberate, glorious death for the ship to give meaning to the meaningless suffering of the nation. The Navy didn't care about winning Okinawa. They cared about making a statement. We will fight to the end, even if that end was just a pile of twisted steel at the bottom of the sea. On April 6th, the crew was called to the main deck at dawn. The sky was gray, a light rain falling. Admiral Seiichi Ito stood on a wooden platform, his uniform crisp, his face hard as stone. He told them the plan, no lies, no sugarcoating. This was a one-way mission. There was no cheering. No one yelled banzai or waved flags. A profound, heavy silence fell over the great ship, so thick you could hear the rain hitting the deck and the waves lapping at the hull. Even the officers stood still, their heads down. Then, the cooks passed out extra rations. Sake, the good stuff, not the cheap rock gut they usually got. Canned beef, imported from Korea. Even chocolate, a luxury Taro hadn't tasted since he was a kid. A final meal. Taro sat with Kenji in their bunk, picking at the beef, which tasted like cardboard. My mom always said I'd die at sea, Kenji said, forcing a laugh that came out as a cough. She just didn't say it'd be like this, going out in a blaze of glory, or whatever the officers are calling it. Taro didn't eat. He wrapped his chocolate in a piece of cloth and gave it to a 17-year-old boy from Kyoto named Hiroshi, who'd lied about his age to join the Navy. He still had acne on his cheeks. For your mom, Taro said. Hiroshi cried. That night, Taro watched sailors tie themselves to railings and gun mounts with rope. They knew if the ship went down, the suction would be immense, strong enough to pull a man under even if he could swim, and the oil fires on the water would burn you alive. Being tied to a large piece of debris was your only chance. Kenji did it, looping rope around his waist and the base of their gun turret. Taro didn't. I want to be free to swim, he told Kenji. Or to choose how I die. Kenji nodded, his eyes glistening. He hugged Taro, quick, tight, and said, if you make it home, tell my sister I'm sorry I missed her wedding. April 7th started perfect, too perfect. Clear sky, calm sea, the sun warm on Taro's face. No wind. Felt like a trick. He stood at his gun, cleaning it for the 10th time that morning, nerves mostly. Kenji beside him, the rope still around his waist. At 10:20 a.m., the radar operator yelled over the intercom, aircraft approaching. Many aircraft. Taro looked up. At first he saw tiny specks on the horizon, like birds or insects. Then the specks got bigger and bigger. By 12:32 p.m., the sky was black with American planes. So many that they blocked out the sun. Hellcats and Corsairs first, fighters, fast and mean, their machine guns blazing as they zoomed in to strafe the deck. targeting sailors and anti-aircraft guns. Then the bombers. Helldivers, screaming down almost vertically from the sky, their bombs whistling as they fell, a sound Taro would hear in his nightmares for 50 years. And the worst ones. Avenger torpedo bombers, flying so low over the waves that their propellers almost touched the water. So close Taro could see the pilots' faces behind their goggles. He even saw one pilot wave, a sick, mocking gesture. "This is it," Kenji said, his voice steady. Taro nodded. He grabbed a shell, jammed it into his Type 96, and waited. The Yamato's anti-aircraft guns opened up all at once, 152 guns firing in unison. A noise so loud it made Taro's ears bleed, so powerful it shook his teeth. He grabbed a shell, jammed it into his Type 96, and pulled the trigger. The gun kicked back, but nothing happened. Jammed. Of course it did. He swore, wrenched the breech open, burning his fingers on the hot metal, pulled out the dud shell, and slammed another one in. This time it fired. Tracer rounds streaked into the sky, pink and green, like fireworks, but the American planes kept coming. They were too fast, too many, too well trained. They flew in tight formations, peeling off one by one to attack, then pulling up before the guns could hit them. A helldiver dropped a 500-pound bomb that hit near the mainmast, 100 yards from Taro's gun. The ship lurched to the side, like a giant had kicked it, and Taro fell to his knees. Fire erupted, orange and black, and thick smoke billowed into the sky, stinging his eyes and making him cough. He looked over at Kenji. He'd been knocked off his feet, but the rope around his waist had yanked him back up, saving him from falling over the edge. "You okay?" Taro yelled, his voice hoarse from the smoke. Kenji nodded, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. He wiped it away with his sleeve and yelled back, "Yeah, you." Taro gave him a thumbs up. Then another bomb hit, closer this time. The deck shook again, and Taro heard someone scream. Then the Avengers hit, low, slow, deadly. They flew so close to the water that Taro could see the salt spray on their wings, could hear the whine of their engines over the guns. He watched as torpedoes slid off their bellies, splashing into the water with a loud splash, leaving white trails as they raced toward the Yamato's port side. Why port? Because the Americans had learned from sinking the Musashi. Hit one side hard enough, flood the watertight compartments, and the ship will tip over, no matter how thick the armor. The first torpedo hit at 1:23 p.m. on the port beam, just below the waterline. Taro felt it in his bones. A deep, shuddering thump that shook the entire ship, like an earthquake at sea. The deck tilted to port just a little, but enough that he had to grab the gun to stay upright. Minutes later, another torpedo hit, same side. Then two more, in quick succession, the thumps coming so fast they blurred together. The list got worse. 10 degrees, 15, 20. Taro's gun was now pointing at the sky. He couldn't aim it anymore, even if he wanted to. Men started sliding across the deck, screaming, trying to grab onto rails or ropes. A Hellcat strafed the bridge, its .50 caliber bullets sparking off the armor like fireworks. Taro looked up and saw the captain's flag get shot to pieces, the red sun torn into rags. He saw officers running across the deck, yelling orders that no one could hear over the noise. The Yamato was dying, and everyone on board knew it. By 2 p.m., the ship was leaning 35 degrees to port. The port side was underwater, waves lapping at the deck, and the starboard side was so high that Taro felt like he was climbing a steel mountain, his boots slipping on the oil-slicked metal. He saw Kenji slip, his foot went out from under him and he fell sideways. The rope around his waist held, but it pulled him to the edge of the deck, his feet kicking at the cold water 80 feet below. "Help me!" Kenji yelled, his voice cracking. Taro reached for him, stretching as far as he could, but a wave of sailors pushed past, all of them trying to get to the higher starboard side, to safety. He lost his balance, fell to his knees, and watched in horror as the rope around Kenji's waist snapped. Old, frayed, not strong enough to hold his weight. Kenji screamed Taro's name as he fell, arms flailing, into the sea. Taro screamed back, but the wind carried his voice away. That's when the order came over the intercom. scratchy and faint. "Abandoned ship!" It was Captain Kosaku Ariga's voice, hoarse and tight. Nothing like the confident tone he used at drills. Abandoned ship. For the Emperor. But for most, it was already too late. The ship was moving too fast, the deck too slippery, the panic too strong. Men were falling over the edge, jumping into the water even though they knew the oil would burn them. Taro saw Hiroshi, the 17-year-old from Kyoto, jump. He didn't even have time to scream. The list was 80 degrees now, almost vertical. Taro was crawling on his hands and knees, his nails digging into the steel deck to get a grip. The oil so thick it covered his hands and face. Men slid past him, their hands outstretched, yelling for help, but he couldn't stop. If he did, he'd be swept away too. The noise of the guns had stopped. Finally. All he could hear was the ship groaning. A deep, terrible sound, like metal twisting, steel snapping with splintering. It was the sound of a giant dying. "It was the scariest sound I ever heard," he said later, tears in his eyes. "Scarier than the bombs. Scarier than the guns. It was the sound of something huge, something we thought was forever breaking apart." He reached the edge of the deck, the starboard side now almost straight up, and looked down. The water was black with oil, dotted with burning debris. Wooden planks, life rafts, pieces of the ship and bodies. He thought of Kenji, of Hiroshi, of his mom and dad. He thought of the Hikari Maru, bobbing in the harbor back home. He didn't think about the Emperor. He didn't think about the war. He just jumped. The fall felt like forever. Wind in his ears, the sun spinning above him, before he hit the water, cold enough to take his breath away. The explosion came 10 minutes later, at 2:23 p.m. Seawater had sloshed into the No. 2 turret's magazine, where hundreds of tons of cordite, gunpowder, were stored. It didn't take much, just a spark, a single drop of water mixing with the dry powder, to ignite it. The flash was so bright that American pilots 10 miles away saw it, even through the smoke. Then the mushroom cloud erupted, fire and black smoke rising 20,000 feet into the sky, higher than Mount Fuji, visible from Okinawa. The blast tore the 70,000-ton ship in half, the metal screaming as it split. The bow rose straight up out of the water, its 3 big guns pointing at the sun like a final middle finger to the sky, before crashing back down with a roar that Taro could feel underwater. The stern followed, sinking so fast it created a vortex. A whirlpool that pulled everything down with it. Debris, sailors, even the thick oil on the surface. Taro was 50 yards away when it happened, treading water, trying to get away. The shockwave hit him like a fist, pushing him 10 feet under the water. He thought he was dead. His lungs burned, his ears rang, everything went black. But something in him, instinct maybe, or the thought of his mom's miso soup, made him kick. He kicked as hard as he could, his legs burning, until his head broke the surface. He gasped for air, coughing up salt water and oil. The sea was a nightmare. Oil covered his face, getting in his eyes, making them burn like fire, and his mouth, tasting like metal and gasoline. Burning pieces of wood floated by, some with sailors still tied to them, their screams echoing across the water as the fire reached their hands and faces. Taro swam as fast as he could, avoiding the fire, until he found a floating plank, part of a life raft, its canvas burned away. He pulled himself onto it, his body so heavy with oil he could barely move, and looked around. The Yamato was gone. Just a patch of bubbling water and a cloud of black smoke where it had been. He didn't see Kenji. He didn't see Hiroshi. He didn't see anyone he knew. Just bodies, bobbing in the oil and silence. The American planes circled overhead for a while, some taking photos. Taro saw a pilot lean out and snap a picture, some just watching. Then they flew away, their engines fading into the distance. Taro sat on the plank for 4 hours, drifting, the sun setting behind him, his hands raw from holding on. He thought about dying, about letting go and sinking into the cold water. He thought about his family, about what they'd do when they got the missing in action letter. He thought about the Yamato and how stupid it all was. "We built this giant," he whispered to himself, his voice hoarse. We called it Unsinkable. We thought it would save us. And it just broke. At dusk, when the sky was pink and orange, he heard a horn. A deep, low sound that cut through the silence. The Japanese destroyer Yukike's, one of the 8 that had sailed with the Yamato, and one of the only 2 that survived, was picking up survivors. Its hull was riddled with bullet holes, its deck covered in blood and debris, but it was still afloat. Taro waved his arm, screaming as loud as he could, his voice cracking, until a sailor on the Yukike's deck saw him. They threw a rope down and Taro grabbed it, his hands so weak he could barely hold on. The sailors pulled him up, his body so stiff with cold and oil that he couldn't stand. He passed out as soon as his feet hit the deck. When he woke up, hours later, a medic was cleaning his eyes with warm water, gently wiping the oil away. "You're lucky, kid," the medic said, smiling. "Only 276 of us made it. Most of the others, well, you saw." Taro closed his eyes. He didn't feel lucky. He felt empty, like a piece of him had sunk with the Yamato. Later, a historian tracked Taro down in Hokkaido in 1980 when he was 58 years old. He asked him to sum up the Yamato to tell the world what it meant. Taro sat on his porch, staring at the sea, for a long time. Then he said, "They told us it was unsinkable. They told us it would win the war. But it was a dinosaur, a beautiful, powerful, terrifying dinosaur. And the world had moved on. The sky was the new ocean. That's the truth of the Yamato. It was a masterpiece of engineering, yes, something that would make any shipbuilder proud. But it was a masterpiece for the wrong century. Built to outduel America's Iowa-class battleships, it was a product of strategic delusion, chasing the glory of battleship warfare long after carriers had become the true rulers of the sea. It embodied Japan's fatal mistake in the Pacific War, valuing pride over practicality, myth over reality, and clinging to the past instead of facing the future. Its legacy isn't just about a sunken ship. It's a lesson etched in steel and sorrow. Pride that blinds us to change turns even the mightiest into relics. It's a reminder that wars are won not by single perfect weapons, but by adaptability, foresight, and respect for the lives of those who fight. Most of all, it's a tribute to the 3,000-plus souls who perished, boys like Kenji, who dreamed of sewing his sister's wedding dress instead of dying tied to a gun mount, like 17-year-old Hiroshi, who lied about his age to be a hero and drowned in oil, like Taro's brothers, lost in distant battlefields. They didn't die for a glorious cause. They died for a flawed dream, one that sank to the East China Sea's depths with the Yamato. Taro carried their memories for 70 years, gardening quietly in Hokkaido, never speaking of the war to his children but keeping that tattered photo of the Hikari Maru in his wallet until he died. These are the true costs of strategic hubris. Not just sunken ships, but broken lives and silent grief. If the story haunts you, if the tragedy of that steel giant and the young men who died on it lingers in your mind, please hit that like button. Every like tells me you care about these forgotten stories, that you want to honor the dead by remembering their humanity. It's what lets me dig through archives for weeks to turn dry history into living, breathing tales. And subscribe. Next week, we're diving into another World War II legend. The Bismarck's doomed final voyage? The Iowa-class's global battles? Or the carrier duel at Midway that turned the Pacific tide? Tell me in the comments which you want first. I read everyone. Until next time, remember this. History isn't just blueprints and dates. It's people, ordinary lives thrown into extraordinary horror, and the lessons we owe them to never forget. History's greatest tragedies aren't carved in memorials. They're written in the faces of boys who never came home, and in the quiet courage of those who did.